Hello, everybody. It's been a little while since we've met. We're going to go into chapter 7. Thank God for everybody. This is Dr. Charles continuing our course on African American history. We are going to get into this teaching here. Um, Let me go ahead and pull up my slideshow here. This is chapter 7. Last time we dealt with chapter 6. And chapter 6 dealt with the building communities in the early republic. I want to remind us of something. When historians talk about the early republic, they're talking about the time period in the 1780s, starting with the 1780s, where we had, as the United States, the country of the United States, we have just won our independence. And we are a new nation. And we signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And we fought the war and won by the 1880s, by the 1780s, excuse me. We are a nation. And often we think about, if you were in a history class, often we focus on white history, people of European descent, that is what happened in the early nation with white folks. And the conversation about African Americans is an afterthought. And, we barely squeeze it in there. Talking about African Americans, we may say something about slavery and briefly. But the cool thing about this we go in depth to talk about Southern slavery. So that's where we are. When we go in depth talking about building communities. That's what it was. If you go back to chapter 6, that was all about building communities in the early republic, building Black communities, African Americans. From a demographic perspective, we looked at the population. Demographic means population. We looked at the number of slaves in New Jersey, 11,000, 21,000 in 1790. Free Blacks in New Jersey was 2,700, almost 2,800 actually, in 1790. So you had a lot of free Blacks too. And we looked at how communities were being built in that early republic. That is when we became early United States. We looked at the rise of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Richard Allen, 1816, the first Black-owned church in the country, first denomination owned by African Americans. We looked at Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Revolution, how they were the first independent Black republic. They won their freedom from France and Haiti. We talked about the African American involvement in the Louisiana Purchase and how that affected African Americans. So these are all things part of the early republic. We talked about the Prince Hall Masons, the rise of Freemasonry during the 1800s in the early United States of America. So it all was focused on, we had the opportunity to think about the Black experience in early America. Spiritual autobiography, we looked at writers. Jupiter Hammond, he wrote his spiritual autobiography. We looked at that's something you don't hear often about African Americans as literary scholars, but even as early as the mid 1700s, you had these great scholars and authors. You had people that wrote literature, pamphlets. You had people like I said, Jupiter Hamilton wrote autobiographies. Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, they wrote a narrative of the proceedings of the Black people during the late awful calamity in Philadelphia. They wrote about widespread disease. Benjamin Banneker was known for his almanac. He was born in 1731. We looked at the role of African Americans in the War of 1812. And so we really had a good conversation. I want you to go back, if you have not, go back and look at chapter 6, that lecture. And if you lost it in your phone, your text message, I'd be happy to send it to you again. Now let's get into Southern slavery. Now remember, there was slavery in the North as well as the South, all the way up to the early 1800s. You had slaves in New York, slaves in Massachusetts. A lot of times when we think about slavery, we think about the South. But you have slavery in different parts of the United States. But let's talk specifically about what Southern slavery looks like. King Cotton. Cotton was a cash crop. People made a lot of money from cotton. Louisiana, having become a state in 1812, underwent a rapid population increase. Once the demand for cotton and sugarcane ushered in rising prices and profits. The same exponential growth was true for Mississippi. I'm on page 131 at the top, second paragraph. Same was true for Mississippi and Alabama, which gained statehood in 1817 and 1819, respectively. According to the census, which did not count Indians, only about 40,000 people resided in Alabama, Mississippi region in 1810. In 1820, the population jumped to 200,000 inhabitants, and 20 years later, it neared the 1 million mark. Gone was the time when southeastern states grew most of the cotton, as they had in the beginning of the century. By 1834, the new states, along with the Gulf Coast, reigned as the land of King Cotton. Those new developed states that had formed around 1810, 1820, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, together produced more than 50%, more than half of the nation's cotton in 1859. So that's why when you hear about slavery, often it's associated with cotton, because people made so much money off of cotton. Why? Because they were using slave labor, but also you had the rise of cotton products. People would begin to understand that it was durable for their clothing, etc. So it became very, very lucrative. In 1794, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin that made it, they could produce more cotton. They could make more money off of it. As I said, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama rapidly grew with the demand of cotton and sugarcane. Growing prosperous in the new states caused a wave of immigrants and greater demand for slaves. So as cotton became more and more prosperous, there became a greater demand for slaves. So that's how a lot of African Americans begin to migrate, or not migrate, begin to be sold to that region. The insatiable demand for cotton resulted in the acquisition of Florida. They bought Florida, the admission of Missouri as a slave state, the annexation of Texas, and then there was a war with Mexico. This is a picture of the cotton gin. You can also find this in our textbook as well on page 130. Here's a map here that I wanted to show you. This map shows the slave trade. You'll notice that, let me make this bigger, I think that's better. You'll notice that where a lot of the slaves went to, slaves in Lower South, slaves in Upper South. A lot of the slaves went to these areas here, slave states. Free states were up here. You had slaves in the Upper South too. So you look at this right here. This would be Virginia area. So by the 1808, 1865, you didn't have slaves up here anymore. So we talked about that. No slaves in the North, mostly in the South. The domestic slave trade, the interstate slave trade, domestic slave trade augmented westward movement. Domestic slave trade was still legal. What I mean by that is selling slaves within the United States. By this time, the Atlantic slave trade was illegal. What I mean by that is going over to Africa, going to Caribbean and getting Black folks and bringing them back to North America and South America. It was illegal by 1808, but it was still legal to trade from Georgia to Mississippi or from Kentucky to Georgia, and et cetera and so forth. Slaves were brought overland in this situation, mostly chained. So in those days, you could see hundreds of slaves sometimes walking for miles and miles and miles, women, men, and children, never dressed correctly for the weather. They would be chained and taken from state to state and put in slave auctions. Slaves were a product sold by business firms. So you actually had firms. You know how you have a Procter and Gamble is a firm that sells soap and products and beauty products, etc. and so forth, hygiene products. You had slave businesses. Their whole business and their whole occupation, their product was slaves, and people made a lot of money off of it. You had a lottery, and you had the highest bidder, and etc. and so forth by slave trading firms. You can find some of the older documents where people would be involved in the slave trade. There is a slave advertisement on page 132. It says, cash, all persons that have slaves to dispose of will do well by giving me a call, as I will give the highest price for men, women, and children. So they were like competing with each other to offer the best price for slaves, which is unthinkable nowadays. So, well, that's the advertisement. I keep getting ahead of myself. This is from 1835. This is literally an advertisement that could be our ancestors. Men, women, and children, any person that wishes to sell will call at Hill's Tavern. And so what they mean by call, they don't mean like a phone call, because phones weren't invented back then. But you could meet somebody, he would be at a tavern at a certain place at a certain time, or just hanging out there doing business. And you can go talk to him and say, I want to purchase slaves. I have money. The domestic slave trade, speculation integral to the slave trading business. Uh, Speculation meaning driving prices up. The prices of slaves in the interstate trade also responded to market factors. This is page 135, the bottom of the second paragraph of 135. Contrary to interpretations of slavery as pre-capitalist, in the early 19th century, the price for prime field hands was modest, ranging from $350 in Virginia to $500 in Louisiana. Later, as the demand for slaves increased in the lower South, prices rose in both the upper and lower South, reaching a high point in 1836. The development of capitalism really goes hand in hand with slavery, the rise of capitalism. And the following year, in 1837, after the onset of the financial turmoil known as the Panic of 1837, there was a pronounced slump in both the price and demand for slaves. Domestic slave trade succumbed, as did other commercial enterprises, to 6 years of severe depression. By the 1850s, however, the slave trade rebounded with skyrocketing prices. In 1860, prime field hands sold for $1,000 in Virginia, and 1,800 in New Orleans, which would have been a lot of money back then. To traders, slavery meant commissions and profits that range from 5% to 30%. They sometimes will make 30% profit. And so you might purchase a slave for 500 and sell them for 800, for example. So you make profit off of it. So it's a very lucrative business. It was a very persistent business too. Slaves gathered in slave pens for direct shipment to New Orleans or for resale to other long distance traders. If we had ever had an opportunity to go to the Freedom Center, they have if you ever been there, they have a slave pen there, an actual slave pen that they reconstructed to show the conditions that people were in before they were sold. Until ended by congressional action in 1850, the District of Columbia was the seat of slave trade. So our nation's capital, that shows you how deep-seated racism is in this country. Washington, D.C. was the center of slave trade. That's the evil that our country was implicit in. So this country was built on slavery and racial prejudice. This is an example of a slave pen. It wasn't a desirable place. Look at the floors. It was dirt floors, it was mud. And many times there was no roof, so they would get rained on. So just very bad conditions. Think about disease, rats, lice, roaches, etc., and so forth. People were not, it was not a healthy place. Now, they would try to clean up the slaves to sell them better, to give the impression that they were healthy, but they were not healthy. It was a capitalist enterprise. I talked about that. Slave trade was financially driven, mostly seen as a capitalist enterprise. What I mean by that is making a profit. The Bible says the love of money is the root of all evil. And that was the case here. You had a great evil, a wickedness that was driven by greed, the lust of men, the lust of white men that use human bodies to enrich themselves. And keep in mind, the reason why more and more slaves were sought to come to the South was to make more money from cotton and sugarcane. Families were separated because slaves brought higher prices when sold individually. You had the early breakdown of the family in those days, and we still are feeling the ramifications of that today. You know, that was a role that Satan played. He was his goal was to break up the families, and he did just that. You could have your children sold. One of the worst things was for a mom to have, say you have 4 children as a woman, and they would sell 2 to Mississippi. You may be way up in Kentucky or Georgia. They sell 2 to Mississippi and 2 more to Louisiana. Some people never did connect with their families. Isn't that wicked? Some people never did reconnect with their families. They spend their whole life trying to find their family, never did reconnect. One of the things that happened when slavery was abolished in 1865 after the Civil War, millions of people sought out looking for their family to be reconnected with husbands. It was the worst when you were in love with somebody. Imagine that trauma. You have a husband or wife that you love, and they're sold to slavery. Harriet Tubman, of course, is one of the best known conductors on the Underground Railroad. Such realities, this is page 134, second paragraph. Such realities precipitated the escape of Harriet Tubman and launched her famous career as a rescuer of slaves. The breakup of the family really caused Harriet Tubman to really go into being a conductor on the Underground Railroad. She was born around 1822, and her real name was Arminta Rose. Harriet Tubman's nuclear family was owned by a couple on Maryland's Eastern Shore. So her family, her father and mother, was owned by a couple in Maryland. The fate of each family member significantly changed in 1824 when the mistress died. Harriet's father, Ben Ross, remained with a slave owner, Anthony Thompson, but Harriet's mother and her siblings, along with Harriet, formed part of the inheritance that passed to the son of the deceased mistress, who was a skilled lumberman and a favorite slave of his master. A skilled lumberman and favorite slave of his master, Harriet's father eventually gained his freedom in 1840. Since Anthony Thompson had provided in his will for the emancipation of all his slaves over a period of years. Harriet, her mother, and her siblings were no longer Thompson's slave property and thus had nothing to look forward to. Instead, so their father was free and they were not, okay? So instead, Harriet and her family remained locked in bondage to a less financially stable carrying man. The quality and circumstances of their lives grew harsher and more painful. To make ends meet, Harriet's owner sold 3 of her sisters into the Lower South. He hired Harriet Tubman to several cruel masters for whom she worked in a variety of jobs, taking care of children, trapping muskrats, working on a timber gang. It was the death of Harriet Tubman's master in 1849 that convinced her to escape. His debts had made it inevitable that he would sell Harriet and separate her family. Her owner had debts, so he was getting ready to sell Harriet and her family and separate them once again. Moreover, Harriet was now married to a free black man named John Tubman. She planned to escape with her husband and brothers, but when the hour came, only she had the courage to flee on foot from Maryland to freedom in Pennsylvania. So she escaped all the way from Maryland to Pennsylvania on foot. Can you imagine that? She walked or ran part of the way. Slave narratives, as well as planters' probate records, legal suits, and advertisements, all confirm the persistent practice of separation of family. The market prices. So when I say market prices, I mean the cost of slaves at that time. Like we have a market today, you know, things fluctuate. The cost of milk, the cost of cars go up and down. Prices of slaves responded to market factors. As demand increased, so did the price of slaves. In other words, as people needed more slaves in the South to harvest crops and cotton, the price went up. And we talked a little bit about economic downturn earlier. The average price of field hands, young slaves, men able-bodied but unskilled. So if you look at, let's take South Carolina, Charlotte. This shows how much the prices went up. And remember, this is the 1800s, so $500 is a lot. Started out by $500 for the price of a field hand. By 1860, it was up to $1,200. Look down at New Orleans. This depended on how much demand people were in, slaves were in, enslaved humans were in for harvesting crops. New Orleans, $500 in 1800. By 1860, it jumped up to 1800. Even though slave trade was abolished, the African slave trade was abolished by 1808, people still did it. And that's one of the things I just recently come to understand. The extent of the illegal slave trade. Atlantic slave trade continued despite its illegality. The movement to reopen African slave trade. So there were people could make much more money if they went over and got fresh slaves as opposed to trading more slaves within the United States. So between 1854 and 1860, every Southern commercial convention considered proposals to reopen Atlantic slave trade. So that was a big fight too. In 1808, federal law was so weak and lax, repeal was not even really necessary. So they didn't always enforce it when people were involved in the Atlantic slave trade illegally. The illegal slave trade from 1808 to 1860. You can see a map here. Most of the illegal slaves went to the South. There's South Carolina, the Deep South, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, Texas. Slave codes. Slave codes were these laws that was used to restrict the movement of slaves. Let me show you something here. I'm going to come off my slideshow for a minute. There's a resource I want to show you. Some of you know this already. You've seen this. There's a resource called Democracy and Me. Let me pull this up in the chat. Hopefully you can see the chat here on the side. Let me find my bearings here. There's a resource I want to show you called Democracy and Me, where I write weekly articles there, educating the public about history, civics, civic engagement, education, social studies, history. And this is an article about slave codes, exploring historic Black codes, combating prejudice with social justice teaching. And it's all about Black codes, early slave codes. Slavery was adopted due to the shortage of workers in the new British North American colonies. A number of factors contributed to the shortage of labor in the American colonies during the mid to late 17th century. One of the primary reasons for the labor shortage was due to expansion of industry. Slave codes, here we go. Slave codes were laws passed in the antebellum South that were designed to perpetuate the system of chattel slavery, permanently locking African Americans to a lifetime of bondage. The slave codes, in effect, made slavery legal in colonies through a series of laws that stripped all human rights from African Americans. The codes dehumanized Blacks, making them socially lower than whites, and effectively keeping them and their offspring slaves for life. During the 17th and 18th centuries, slave codes prohibited activities such as interracial relationships, greatly restricted slaves' ability to travel outside of the plantation, making manumission, the act of slavery, slave masters freeing their slaves, virtually impossible. So that's a little bit about slave codes. Let's get back to our slide presentation because I got a lot of material that I want to try to get through pretty quickly here. The passage of slave codes accompanied the expansion of slavery. So as slavery began to broaden, they passed more laws to restrict the movement of African Americans. Codified viewpoint that slaves were not bad people, or I'm sorry, that they did see us as bad people, but slaves were viewed from a legal standpoint as property, not people. From a business standpoint, they viewed them as a product. Slaves were denied most rights of freedom. The laws often made stricter in response to insurrection. So when people would escape and overthrow the slave masters, they would come up with stricter laws. There were various practices that were designed to enforce slave codes, like slave patrollers, for example. It was required by every white male on the plantation to volunteer to be a slave patroller. They were designed to restrict the movement of Blacks. So if you saw an African American somewhere you thought they shouldn't be, you could ask for a pass. And if you didn't have your pass or proper explanation, you could be beaten or, killed or what have you. So this is a system that still has some ramifications to today. People sometimes connect neighborhood watch communities to this time of slave patrollers where people feel obligated to monitor and police the movement of Black folks. But at the same time, let me make a correction. Sometimes they didn't always want to harm the slaves because they were property, and they didn't, or throw them in prison because they did not want to affect the owner's investment. But you can find a conversation about slave codes on page 139, slave patrollers. Well, let me say more. A type of militia, free white men were expected to serve on patrol for a period of time, almost like jury duty. We're all obligated in our society to, if we're called upon, to be a part of jury duty. Same concept of the patrol. They were during a certain period of time. They serve. Let me read this. A free white man was expected to serve on patrol for a period of time, apprehending runaway slaves and returning them to the masters. That was your obligation. In quiet time, slave codes disregarded, and slaves were given more freedom. Masters tend to prefer taking matters regarding their slaves into their own hands. They didn't want nobody else messing with their property. On the plantation, the work of slaves was primarily agricultural. That's a social studies word. It was a farming society. That's what we mean. Most of the work was farming. And a lot of it was cotton and sugarcane and rice in the deep South. And then tobacco in Virginia, those kinds of things. But the most lucrative was cotton. In 1860, 3/4 of all white people in the South did not own slaves. So when we think about movies like Roots, we think of these large plantations. We think a lot of white folks had slaves, but only the wealthy had the large plantations. Some people, when they did have slaves, they only had one or two, the more poor families. Slaves were concentrated in the hands of a relatively few people. The bulk of staple crops produced on large plantations was factored in. Owners dominated political and economic thinking. So the slave owners, the plantation owners had a lot of influence in society. and they influenced Senate. They influenced what was going on in politics, local politics and national politics. Field hands, the large plantations had two groups of workers. You had house servants and field hands at the large plantation. That wasn't the case everywhere. Sometimes, as I said, you might have a husband and wife and children. They might have two slaves that can help them do the farming. And the white guy got right out there, and the mother and children got right out there with the slave. So don't think all of the plantations were these large, all of the slaves situations were these large plantations. There was not. You had to be extremely wealthy to have 300 slaves. Uh, Work regimen of cotton was very demanding. My grandmother was a sharecropper in Georgia. She talks about how hard cotton picking was, and cotton harvesting. You had to cotton doesn't grow really high like corn or wheat. It grows pretty low to the ground, so you spend a lot of times bent over picking the cotton, and it's hard work. In fact, the life expectancy of slaves was very low. Slaves died really old age for a slave was their 40s. Um, you had the gang labor system used. They believed that one slave needed for every 3 acres of cotton. The gang labor system was a group of slaves working together, and they had a quota on how much cotton you needed to harvest. Work hours were the longest during harvest time. Divided by gender, gender labor division. Certain jobs were identified by sex. Slave women were integral to the plantation economy. They ranked each other's status according to creative ability. They also worked in the fields alongside men. So, of course, the women were often the domestic servants. They were in the field house. Not all the time, though. In a plantation house. On the plantation, overseers and brutality. Overseers were brutal. I encourage you to watch. There's a couple of films I encourage you to watch. Harriet, 12 Years a Slave, The Django Unchained. Those are some really good depictions of slavery. There's a series called Underground. They did 2 seasons of it. That's beautifully done. That's another one. But overseers were employed on farms of more than 20 slaves, where owners was an absentee landlord. So often the owner did not always live on the plantation. So you had these absentee landlords that were responsible for watching over the plantation. There was no personal interest in slaves' welfare. So the overseers didn't really care whether the slaves lived or died. But also the owner was this conflict because owners wanted to protect their property. So the owners demanded overseers to get most out of the slaves, often treated slaves with brutality. So some owners, let me take that back. Some owners um, wanted to get as much work as they could out of the slaves. So they pushed the overseer to get that work out as by any means possible. But at the same time, they didn't want to damage the property because that affected their investment. Some plantations employed driver slaves, so they used slaves to set the pace. They assisted the overseer and compelled work from the fellow slaves. They were often viewed as traitors, as they hated the driver slaves because they worked for the master. What did the slaves eat? Each slave household received a ration of meal and salt pork, cornmeal, sometimes allowed to maintain their own gardens. Some even allowed to market their produce. So some were able to sell. A more benevolent master enabled slaves to sell their product. But the slave diet was very meager. In some households, like Frederick Douglass, he ate very well, but that wasn't always the case. In fact, Frederick Douglass he ate more than the white males, the poor whites in the neighborhood. And he would trade them food. He would give them food for reading lessons. So that wasn't always the case. Many times slaves were malnourished because they didn't get the proper diet. Um, so one of the things we should know is that slavery was different in the city versus in the country. Now let's remember the word urban means city and rural means country. In the rural settings, slavery looked different. It was more agricultural, especially in the South. It was sometimes the large plantations, but that you would have been harvesting cotton and planting cotton, and those large plantations, the rice fields, the sugar cane. But in the urban setting, it's going to look different. You have Black artisans and inventors. Black artisans were these skilled tradespeople, like carpenters, um, welders, um, blacksmiths. That's what I was trying to think of. Inventors. Slaves were very talented. Black folks were very talented. They demonstrated that in skilled trades. Slave used in pottery, textile mills, iron furnaces, tobacco factories. They were very gifted. They weren't these ignorant, unlearned people that's often perpetuated in the stereotypes. Slaves proved valuable as inventors. Of course, they were not allowed to get a patent. After 1861, slave owners could be issued patent for his or her slave inventions. So after 1861, if I invented something as a Black man, my slave owner could get my patent. So they stole every aspect of who we were. This was a well-known slave carpenter, Haywood Dixon. Slaves were known for being very skillful artisans, very skillful artisans. And often they were well sought out by white men. And sometimes they could hire themselves out and make money. Some African Americans had the opportunity to purchase their freedom by hiring out their skills. I like reading about this because we often hear about such negativity. Slave hiring. Owners put slaves out for hire in the period between harvest and new planting. Some urban slaves allowed to self-hire. I talked about this, I keep getting ahead of myself. Although illegal under Southern law, self-hire gave dual sense of freedom and its limits. And so it was illegal, but slaves still were hired out and they could make money that way. Slaves could not legally contract for their services. Contract was between the master and hiring employer. Contract was between the master and hiring employer. So often you couldn't contract with another person as a slave. Again, you were property. Social and cultural life. Social and cultural life. Slaves, personal expression and recreation, a rejection of chattel principle. So chattel, that word there means that people are property. But if I had personal expression as a human, that contrasted this idea that I was an object. I was a person, really, I'm a person. Religious activity, for example. Worship services were held on larger plantations and in towns. With the rise of abolition movement and rumors of slave conspiracies, slaves increasingly made to attend owners' churches. And so they sat in separate sections. The earliest example of segregation. We read about Richard Allen in the AME Church, how the AME Church came out of the idea of segregation. So this was the North, of course, where Blacks were free. But remember, just because African Americans were free in some places, that doesn't mean they were not discriminated against. And at Mother Bethel AME Church in 1816, just a reminder, they had a Black section and a white section of church. And I think that there was not room in the white section, in the Black section. So they were praying in the white section without even realizing it. And that spirit of anger and racism stirred up in the church of the devil, and they dragged them off their knees. From that point on, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, they started their own movement. Said, we're going to worship the Lord without having to worry about people discriminating against us. In the South, of course, you had these segregated churches. But often you have what's called the invisible institution. A lot of the way Black folks worship today came out of these invisible institutions. You had the sanctioned church services that Blacks went to, where they went to white churches and they sat with white churches. But in the still of the night or in secret, they went out and had worship God in their own way. And that's the invisible institution. They snuck and did it without being under the watchful eye of the slave master. And furthermore, the sermons they were often getting at the white churches was sermons of racism. They were taught basically to obey their masters. When they sat in segregated sections, the earliest example of segregation the book talks about. This is a slave wedding, the concept of jumping the broomstick um, comes from this time period. Slaves were, this is from 1838. This is an early painting that shows a slave wedding. I like this artwork. I like to look at artwork. Artwork gives us a glimpse of what things were like even before photography was invented. Social life of African Americans. The slave church is blended Christianity and folk beliefs. What we mean by folk beliefs is African American culture, Black culture, African culture. It blends the way we sing songs. It has African roots. Like when we say, made a vow to the Lord, and I won't take it back, made a vow to the Lord, and I won't take it back. That's call and response. One person, you have a leader that sings it, and another person, the congregation joins in. Or Father, I stretch my hands to thee. Father, I stretch my hand to thee. That's very African. So the blending of Christianity with these folk beliefs. Slave families. The permanency of slave families, marriages depended on the opportunity to live and work together. Sometimes the husband would live on one plantation and the wife would live on another. It made it difficult. Sometimes you would imagine this, the husband had to sneak off the plantation just to spend time with his wife on another plantation. That's horrible. Childbearing was difficult. There was inadequate medical care given for slave women. Interracial relationships were very common. Often the white men, the slave men, would be attracted to slave women. As we know, African American women are very attractive, and human nature was going to prevail, regardless of whether they looked at them as slaves or not. Slave masters would be attracted to them. In most cases, there was a rape situation where Black women were forced to be in sexual relationships with white men, slave masters, or his son. In rare cases, a romantic relationship did involve, maybe more common than we think, there were literally single slave masters that were in these relationships with these Black women. It couldn't be anything legal. They couldn't get married because legally Black women were property in the slave situation. But also you had, interestingly enough, white women would be in relationships with Black male slaves too. That was more common than you would think, because it's human nature. You have people living close together. In some cases, 70% of the people on the plantation were Black, or 80% or 90. And all these Black folks around you, around the white folks, and human nature takes place. People start liking each other and have a love interest. So you had children born of slave women and white women was visible throughout the South. You've seen a lot of biracial children. Most often it was the result of rape, sexual assault. Biracial slaves, the treatment by white fathers varied sometimes. White fathers would take ownership of their son, their biracial children. Sometimes not just sons and daughters. Sometimes the white father pretended that it didn't happen. They're so wicked, pretended that was not his son or daughter. But some were so kind as to free their slave children who were biracial. And I'm wrapping up here. Resistance. I always used to say that if I were doing slave times, I would escape or I would resist with the type of mindset I have. But slave markets, slaves used tricks in order to gain control over would-be purchasers. Exhibited behavior appealing to a master of their choosing, pretended to be sick or weak in front of undesirable masters. I think that's funny. So when they were at a slave auction, they would pretend to be sick or a less desirable slave if they saw a slave master they did not desire to be with. But they would try to appear attractive and desirable if they saw somewhere they wanted to be. And when I say slave market gambits, I mean various things people would do to resist. Sabotage or suicide. Many times there is they would break tools on the farm. They would sabotage stuff to get back at the master. Breaking farm tools, as I said, sometimes would commit suicide. They would say, rather than being a slave, I'm going to get back at master one last time and destroy his property, which is their body. Sometimes they would self-mutilate, break their arms and break their hands. It sounds really tough and disturbing, but it is a disturbing and tough institution. And they would break their hands and things so they could be an ineffective worker. Running away, a lot of slaves ran away. The most common form of overt resistance was running away. Federal and state legislation sought to aid in recovery of runaway slaves. By 1850, you had the Fugitive Slave Act, which gave northern states the right to recapture a slave, even though they may have escaped to a free state. The best thing to do at that time was to go all the way to Canada. There were violent resistance. Owners feared violent resistance. Slaves would poison their masters. They would murder their masters. Slavery vaults. One of the biggest slavery vaults was Haiti. We talked about that with Toussaint over there. They won their freedom from France. People would escape together and start their own communities. Maroon communities where slaves would go deep in the forest and start their own towns and communities. Sometimes they last for years, and they were sometimes so deep in the swamp, the authorities couldn't get to them, or they fought so well. They had their own military defense system. This is an example of something you would see. This is from 1837. It's a reward, a handbill for a runaway slave, $150 reward. You might want to check this out. This is in the book on page 156. This is a pretty interesting chart, the major American slave rebellions. Often we don't hear about slave rebellions when we talk about Black history, but there was many. Even as early as 1712, New York City conspiracy, 21 were executed, 6 estimated suicide, 6 pardoned. There were 30 to 40 people participated, 9 white deaths. The Stonewall rebellions, 75 to 80 involved. 25 whites were killed. The Gabriel Prosser's conspiracy, 40 Black participated, 0 whites were killed there. 35 executed, 4 escaped, 1 suicide. So on and on and on. The Black Seminole Rebellion, this is one of the largest ones. Maroon and slave combined, over 1,000 people, almost 1,300 people estimated escaped, 400 whites killed, 500 immigrated to west with the Indians, 90 or more were caught, re-enslaved, hundreds more surrendered to slavery, casualties unknown. So some escaped. So this is just an example. The Denmark Vesey conspiracy, freed Blacks who plotted slave revolt. Whites caught wind of the conspiracy and rounded up the suspects. Nat Turner believed he had been selected by God to deliver his people from slavery. They began a revolt by killing his master and family. Revolt spread rapidly until overpowered by states and federal troops. This is the image of Nat Turner and his followers. So we'll end there. God bless y'all. Thank you for listening in. Let me know if you have questions. Please leave a question in the comment in the YouTube. It's very helpful when you do that, or it's your thoughts or a response to it. You might just be like, I like this part. I really like when we talk about that. Makes it more interactive. So We'll meet again in person at some point. I will talk to y'all later. Thank you.